before we come back onto the Rense Network, our Guerrilla Media Network listeners will have the opportunity to listen to my next guest, Mr. Tom Harris. And here's a great way to introduce him to our listening audience here as we come off of the top of the hour. So without further ado, here we go.
Scientists were the ones who mostly discussed it. And they never said things like, we have to stop climate change, because they knew that climate always changed. In fact, the only constant about climate is change. If you look through the history of the Earth, ever since we had an atmosphere, the climate has changed, sometimes very quickly, sometimes slowly. It's gotten hotter, it's gotten colder. This kind of thing is normal. So the whole concept of stopping climate change is a bit ridiculous. Climate change is something we hear in the media constantly. We hear it in Congress all the time. And we hear one statement over and over. Scientists have agreed. There's an enormous problem, a catastrophe, something that we are causing, and we must stop it now. Well, I think after tonight's presentation, you might wonder if some of that makes any sense at all. You see, climate change is in an era of negative discovery. Negative discovery means the more you learn, the more you realize you don't understand. And in fact, science is like that in many, many fields. I mean, in the field of plate tectonics, for example, at the very beginning, they didn't really understand how it worked. And the whole idea that there were plates on the Earth, this was nuts, okay? The skeptic who suggested this was disgraced in the field. But now it's accepted as one of the common things. In fact, you could say that the science of plate tectonics is settled. But the science of climate change is just in its infancy. I mean, think about it. Since 1997, when the Kyoto Protocol was created, there's been more money spent in fundamental climate change research than in all history combined before. I mean, if they weren't discovering something new, you'd say, holy smokes, what is all this money going for? The first thing I'm going to talk about is clouds, okay? Clouds are a much more important driver of climate change than anything humans are doing. I mean, it's an order of magnitude or more important. And only recently, perhaps 10 years ago, we thought that clouds were a net positive feedback to the Earth's climate system. In other words, we believed that more clouds led to higher temperatures because clouds were contributing to the greenhouse effect. But recently they've found that that's not true at all. In fact, clouds reflect so much sunlight back into space that they are a net negative contributor to climate change. In other words, the Earth gets cooler when there are more clouds. And you can actually see that on this graph here. Here are early models which showed how much the Earth would, in this case, warm because of clouds. But as they got to more and more sophisticated models, this is where they are now. Okay, they show that clouds cause a net cooling of the planet. Now remember, clouds have many, many times the impact on climate than humans do. The science is settled? I mean, come on. This is an obvious example of where the science is totally unsettled. The more we learn, the more we realize we don't understand. We have to learn to take much of what people tell us for sure about the Earth and the future of the planet with a really big grain of salt.
Okay, welcome back. We are all lit up, ready to go into this second hour of the Pete Santilli Show. And my next guest, Mr. Tom Harris, has 30 years of experience as a mechanical engineer, project manager, science and technology communications professional, technical trainer, S&T advisor, to a former opposition senior environment critic in Canada's Parliament. For the past 14 years, he's been working with a team of scientists and engineers to promote a sensible approach to range of energy and environmental topics, climate change in particular. And we just shared, actually, for our Guerrilla Media Network listeners, an excerpt of a presentation that he gave in Kentucky. But Mr. Harris has regularly published in newspapers in Canada and the U.S. and occasionally in Australia, New Zealand, the U.K., and other countries. He's often interviewed on radio and occasionally TV. Mr. Harris is the past executive director of the National Resources Stewardship Project. From 2009 to 2011, he taught a total of 1,500 students of climate change and earth sciences perspective. A second-year course in the Faculty of Sciences at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. He speaks about the approach he's taken with this course, and I have actually linkages to share with you a little bit more about Mr. Harris. I listened to him on a couple of I saw a couple of YouTube videos. He came highly recommended as an expert in his field by Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire. But Mr. Harris, welcome to the Pete Santilli Show.
Yeah, hi, Pete. Hi, Susanna.
How are you? Thank you very much for joining us. This is an important topic that we've covered, and we've covered it from a layman's or a novice's perspective, trying to understand as much as we can about climate change. But just as you've described, the more we learn, the more we realize we don't know and won't know.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you know, one thing people don't understand is that there's no such thing as a theory of climate. You know, we have theories of gravity, we have theories of all sorts of things that allows us to forecast the future. But the fact is, we don't understand the science well enough to have a theory of climate. The climate models that we have are nothing more than curve fitting. We guess at what we think is the main controllers of climate. We try it out. Over a period of time, we see how it diverges from reality. Then we go back and adjust the models. But we're really just guessing at this point because science is simply too immature. So when people talk about the computer models forecasts for the future, really that's a guess. And if you ask scientists behind closed doors, is it going to be even hotter or colder in the next 20 years? They say, ask me in 20 years. They don't know. And, so we're really not talking about is it going to be 1 degree warmer or 3 degrees warmer. We don't even know, as in the case of clouds, we don't even really know whether or not it's going to be warmer or colder. And that's a big problem because right now all the governments of the Western world are preparing for warming, whereas in fact cooling is much more dangerous, but also, perhaps, according to some scientists, more likely.
Yes, sir. Let me ask you something. I believe, especially with what I'm seeing with Al Gore and his businesses that he sets up and all of his terminology he's used over the past several years, I really see this as a means by which they can inject fear into our, please excuse the expression, the dumbed-down population that doesn't understand these scientific principles, but to inject fear into us to cause us to pay taxes.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, there's a whole new vocabulary that has been created which really distorts the science and injects fear into the equation. I mean, the most obvious one you heard from President Obama when he spoke at Georgetown University. He calls it carbon pollution, climate change pollution. But carbon dioxide, which is what they're talking about, is the stuff of life. Without CO2, there'd be no plants, there'd be no life on Earth, except perhaps the deep volcanic vents in the ocean. So, the vocabulary that's used, climate change is real. Well, of course it's real. What a ridiculous statement. I mean, so is supernovas in distant galaxies, but that doesn't mean that we cause it. But the whole language of the debate has become skewed so that, as you say, to design it so that people will be afraid.
I've also had guests on previously that described that the condensation produced by even jet aircraft and the thousands and thousands of them that are in the air above the United States of America produces enough cloud cover to change the regular natural weather patterns. Do you believe that?
I think that there is a slight cooling effect because, of course, they're putting out water vapor, which contributes to clouds in the local vicinity, so you would see some cooling. But, I don't think that that's a major driver. A bigger factor, of course, by far, is if the ocean's warm or the ocean's cool, you're going to see a great deal more evaporation, and that is, in fact, the main source of carbon dioxide and water vapor in our atmosphere. One thing that people don't realize is that nature can change the CO2, the carbon dioxide, which is the main greenhouse gas that people are worried about. Nature can change carbon dioxide all on its own. Every year, there are massive changes in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. In fact, the rate of change can be as much as 300% from year to year. And yet the amount humans put out only increases about 1% per year. So nature is changing CO2 enormously more than we are. One thing people don't realize is that if you take, for example, a glass of soda out of the fridge or a can of soda, and you open it up and let it warm up to room temperature, it will eventually become flat because the CO2 will be released as the pop warms, as the soda warms. Mm-hmm. Well, the same thing happens to the ocean. When the Earth warms, for whatever reason, probably due to the sun, the Earth releases, or the ocean releases a great deal of CO2 into the atmosphere. And they're finding when they look at the ice core records that, yes, CO2 and temperature go up and down together. Al Gore's right as far as that's concerned. But the trouble is, you see, he doesn't show you the cause and effect relationship. He gives the impression that the CO2 goes up and temperature follows, but it's exactly the opposite. As the ocean warms due to whatever cause, then eventually, centuries later, as much as 800 years later, the CO2 rises. And that's because the ocean's giving it off. It has nothing to do with humans.
What do you say to the, and this is something that, from, like I said, a layman's perspective, I'm noticing some pretty significant weather events that take place throughout the world. I mean, but it's no different than it has been over many thousands of years, correct?
Yes, that's true. And even over the past century, the current weather events are not unusual. For example, in the 1930s, we saw far more high temperature records set than in the 1990s and 2000s. And in fact, the extreme weather that we're experiencing now is part of a natural cycle. You see, for example, the incidence of cyclones, which in the North Atlantic are called hurricanes. But if you look at the incidence of cyclones around the world, we're now near a 30-year low. Okay, but we're actually at a fairly, reasonably high number of hurricanes in the North Atlantic, although this year it's been quite weak. But the bottom line is that whether it's droughts or floods, whether it's wildfires, all these things have natural cycles which are completely independent of humans. However, the impact on humans is very severe, and because of the fact that we have a much denser population than we did 100 years ago, we're going to, first of all, see these events more often. There'll be more reports of things like tornadoes, but the impact of it will be much worse. There's a 13-fold increase in infrastructure around the world in the last century. So, for example, in Florida, where there's 13 hotels now, a century ago there would be one. Now, the hotels are more hardened to hurricanes, so that individually they're not damaged as much. But overall, the damage will be a great deal more economically, because of the fact there's just many more targets. Mm-hmm. But the actual hurricane intensity and the actual cyclone intensity is not increasing. In fact, one of our advisors has a brother who works in cyclone forecasting in India, and he's worried that he may lose his job because there's just not enough cyclones for the department to keep all their people. So, indeed, around the world, we see extreme weather events, and, there is a way to get ready for that. And Manhattan demonstrated it very well during Hurricane Sandy. Actually, it was really a tropical cyclone. It only barely came to hurricane level 1. You see, during Hurricane Sandy, a lawyer in Manhattan was typing an email, a letter to the editor, to the New York Times. It was actually published in the New York Times. And what he said is, here I sit in the middle of Hurricane Sandy. I have full electricity. I have full connectivity. My internet's working. No problem. My telephone, everything else, okay? And the reason is because all my cables are buried underground. So that's an ideal way to adapt to extreme weather, to climate change. But the idea that we can stop it, that we can control it, this is really a fairy tale. It's like something out of King Canute, the English king who brought his throne down to the seashore and commanded the waves to stop. Well, of course, the waves continued just like they always did. And the tide came in until he was half submerged. But, King Canute did that on purpose. He knew the tide would come in. He knew he had no control over that. But he wanted to demonstrate to his courtiers that, in fact, there were limits to his power because they were boasting that their king could do anything. Unfortunately for the U.S. and also for everyone who's allied with the U.S., like us here in Canada, President Obama really does believe that the United States can stop global climate change. And so he's dedicating enormous resources to it, and he's unfortunately spreading this to other parts of the world. When he was just in Africa, for example, he was announcing this new Power Africa initiative that you folks are going to very generously fund out of your enormous amount of money that you don't have to borrow from China. And the trouble is, he is focused not on helping them adapt to climate change, which would actually make sense, but he's focused on trying to stop it. And to do that, he's completely going to distort Africa's energy supply the same way he's distorting the United States' energy supply by getting rid of the most powerful source and the least expensive source, and that is coal. And that's the big tragedy in all this, is not only a lot of people are going to lose their jobs, but the United States is going to be in big trouble when you close down your biggest and least expensive energy source.
Yes, sir. That's a perfect segue. We're going to take a brief break here, if you don't mind, and then we'll come back, and I want to talk to you about your organization, International Climate Science Coalition, ICSC. Is that your current,
That's right.
your current website? And I want to talk to you about the dangerous impacts of attempts to replace conventional energy sources when we come back after this break. Okay, we're back with Mr. Tom Harris, and his organization, his website is actually clientscienceinternational.org, and his organization, International Climate Science Coalition, is a nonpartisan group of independent scientists, economists, and energy and policy experts who are working to promote better understanding of climate science and policy worldwide. And what struck me when I read an excerpt on his website, it said that they are also concerned about publicizing the repercussions of misguided plans to solve the climate crisis and the dangerous impacts of attempts to replace conventional energy resources with wind turbines, solar power, biofuels, and other ineffective and expensive energy sources. That's a pretty impactful statement, Mr. Harris.
Yes, and it certainly doesn't make us friends among many government people.
I bet not.
Who are telling us that we're going to, support the country energy on wind power, which of course is ridiculous. The bottom line is that the most reliable source of power is, of course, coal. And the United States was built on coal. Right now, it still supplies more than 40% of your electricity. And yet, unfortunately, President Obama has a war on coal. In fact, he said before he became president, he told the San Francisco Chronicle that, yeah, you can start a coal station, you can start a coal mine, but we'll make it so you go bankrupt. And that's unfortunately what's happening. In the last 6 months, a number of major coal companies have seen their stocks gone to half the current value. And the bigger threat, obviously that's an enormous threat to people who've got their savings in there, but the bigger threat is that we simply won't have enough energy. In England, for example, they shut down about 1/6 of their complete electrical supply because they think they're going to help stop climate change by closing their coal stations. And we had a fellow, Benny Peiser, from Liverpool University touring Canada, and he was giving a presentation called Eat or Heat. And that's the choice that will be facing a lot of seniors in England this coming winter, people on fixed incomes who will have to turn their heat down if they're going to have enough money left over to heat, or to eat, And the bottom line is that this is very, very dangerous. They think that they're actually contributing to stopping climate change, which, of course, is insane because humanity in total is doing virtually nothing to the climate. But even if it were true, you have to realize that the whole of England's sacrifice would be made up by China in a number of weeks because China, of course, is growing very quickly, almost exclusively on coal. Now, of course, their coal is dirty coal, and they don't use very much in the way of pollution control, so they have a great deal of problems in our cities. But in the Western world, coal has become a much cleaner energy source than it ever was in the past. And so, indeed, Obama's war on coal is a big threat to the United States. I think that, you're going to see a preview this winter of what will come to the U.S. if you try to turn off coal too quickly. They talk about natural gas. They say fracking, that's a great alternative to coal because it's a cleaner fuel. Now, that's not easy to do, though, because you've got to build all those pipelines. You've got to build all the infrastructure to do your heating, to do your electricity generation. It's not going to happen overnight. So the idea that you destroy your major energy source, this is terrible. It's the real big threat to the United States, and it's a threat also to other parts of the world because this is being forced by Obama on other parts of the world. Canada, for example, our government has said point blank, we're going to follow the U.S. on climate. So we don't really have an independent climate policy at all. We're following you. So if you go down the drain, we're headed with you. The same thing with Africa, where the Power Africa initiative, they are boosting every energy source except the most important. 90% of South Africa's electricity comes from coal. And in fact, South Africa supplies 90% of the coal for the whole of the African continent. Yet that is the one energy source that Obama will not support in Africa. And unfortunately, that tendency, the World Bank and others are saying the same thing. We're not going to support coal-fired generation unless they have sequestration of carbon dioxide underground. And that's a red herring, actually, because we're not going to have that technology for at least a decade, and maybe never. Okay, it's in its demonstration phase right now, and it may prove to not be possible on a national scale. So what they're really doing is they're simply killing the most important energy source for the West, something that built the United States.
Wow. Wow, and I've always seen that that we've over-regulated businesses, made it almost impossible for them to stay within the whatever's left of the manufacturing industry. But you know what I've seen? I've seen our population grow. We have 7 billion consumers on the planet that we still need stuff manufactured, and all of the pollution has just basically been shifted to China in an unregulated market almost. Is it not? Is that not the case? It's the same amount of pollution, just in a different country, and we can just ignore it, right?
Well, it's going to be worse because you figure if you have these companies moving to China because China will not impose CO2 regulations, no matter what they say. They'll tell the West that they're going to impose CO2 regulations, but the West has been hoodwinked. And I'll tell you why. This is something almost nobody seems to know. I don't know, maybe they don't read the agreements, but they're working on a Cancun-based agreement to be agreed to in 2015 to come into force in 2020. But what people don't tell you, the Stern, who's the climate commissioner, so to speak, for the United States, he's the main negotiator. In Canada, the same thing. We have negotiators up here. They talk about this new treaty that's going to be a worldwide treaty. Everyone's going to have targets, they say. It's not like Kyoto. It's going to be, a very fair agreement, and we're going to stop climate change. But the trouble is, this is not what's going to happen. You see, the Cancun-based treaties are actually two treaties. They're not one treaty because the West and the developing countries are treated entirely differently. The West has to impose its targets no matter what impact it has on its economy. But the developing countries, and it's very clear in the UN document, they're not hiding it. Many of these things they're doing are not hidden if you're smart enough to read it. They say point blank that the first and overriding priority for developing countries will be the elimination of poverty and development. And so what they're saying, and China and India know this, okay, so they say, oh yeah, sure, we'll sign this agreement. But they have an out clause, because if the first and overriding priority is violated, then they don't have to reduce emissions at all.
Wow.
And there's no way that you can turn off these coal stations and have it not impact your economy or pulling people out of poverty. So what I think will happen is in 2015, the American delegates, Canadian delegates, British delegates will tell their people, we have a worldwide agreement, this is fair, this is not like Kyoto. The Chinese and the Indians will smile and they'll say, yes, that's indeed, we agree. Knowing full well that when the time actually comes to cut emissions, they'll say, sorry, we have an out clause and we don't have to do it. So I think the West is being completely tricked, and that, this is a disaster in the making.
Very interesting. Mr. Harris, thank you so much for joining us. Your website is climatescienceinternational.org, and we can go over there to find out more about your efforts. Thank you very much for your service to the world as far as propagating truth for once in this very controversial topic of climate science. It's almost a hoax, but thank you so much for your contributions. Thanks for joining us here on the Pete Santilli Show. Yep.
Thanks a lot.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be back right after this break.